I have not been sleeping very well lately. I don't know what happened, but I just can't even do it. I've been like laying down and then being awake. And so I don't know, it's kind of the most annoying problem ever because when I'm awake, I want to sleep and I can't sleep. I don't know. I don't It'll probably get better soon. Some people have it much worse than I do. Some people like actually have insomnia. I just have had this for like 3 days. But the reason I'm explaining this to you is because I just saw it myself and I was like, "Whoa, I look tired." Okay, day 30, page 223. Pearl is in position. Where is she? Okay. The men gathered around Moses included some of the biggest names in American architecture. Oh, right. They're planning the super huge park structure thing. And all the architects are like, this is preposterous. And Moses is like, no, it's going to happen. They didn't. Okay, the men gathered around Moses included some of the biggest names in American architecture, but they didn't think big enough for him. When they began drawing up tentative plans, the plans naturally included a water tower. Fresh water had to be provided in great quantities in any large park, of course, but their water towers were conventional water towers, aluminum storage tanks set on four spindly uprights. They were exactly like the ones that, in other parks, were invariably the unsightliest feature of the landscape. Okay, water tower haters have arrived. Moses determined to turn the potentially ugliest part of the park he had planned into its most beautiful. He already knew that he wanted a focal point for the beach, a beautiful centerpiece big enough to be seen from miles away. That would be a symbol of Jones Beach, something that visitors could identify with. He was, after all, the son of the woman who had ordered the huge Camp Madison banner. And it might, man, I really love when he does these throwbacks to the first chapter because it's always stuff that I'm like, right. You can tell it's like right on the edge of my memory, about to fall off the cliff into oblivion. But it's like, oh, right, like the big banner. And it might as well be the water tower. But he had a hard time getting the architects to think in his terms. Quote, I was very anxious to have this water tower mean something architecturally, he recalls. I got the top people out there and I asked them about it. The first suggestion came from our chief engineer, and I said, that's the goddamnedest stupid thing I've ever heard. And then somebody suggested a lighthouse, and I said, "No, goddamn it, we're not going to have any lighthouse. We already had a lighthouse, for God's sake." He was referring to the Fire Island Lighthouse, which was visible from the eastern end of Jones Beach. On the next trip to the beach, Harvey Corbett suggested that the water tower be designed as an Italian campanile or church bell tower. There were many different types, Corbett said, and started to reel them off. As he was reeling, he mentioned the one in Venice. Venice! I like the one in Venice best, Moses said. According to one of the men there, he pulled out another one of his envelopes and skewered the campanile in Venice right there. And that's how the water tower was done. Oh, sketched, not skewered. And that's the way most everything was done. He had the architects and engineers there, but he was the architect and the engineer of Jones Beach. He's more responsible for the design of Jones Beach than any architect or engineer or all of us put together. Finding the bathhouse designs submitted by the famous architects unimaginative, Moses selected those of a young, unknown commission staffer, Herbert Magoon, real name. That's a good one. Magoon had designed two vast pleasure palaces to sit upon the sand. I really hope that he defines what a pleasure palace is. Otherwise, I'm going to have bad ideas. One was a long, low, sweeping expanse of brick and stone and green-tinted glass. Its central portion, a terrace, raised just 5 feet above the beach. Behind the terrace, wide expanses of green-tinted glass separated by thin vertical stone columns that held another set-back terrace surmounted by canopies, and behind that terrace a wall topped with flags was set off from two wings of glass and brickwork by two simple, square, flat-topped medieval turrets. It was simple, almost austere from a distance, but Magoon's detailed drawings showed Moses that the turrets and walls had been cunningly worked with 1,000 little devices of stone and brick. The other bathhouse was, if also made of stone and brick, much gayer. Middle Eastern, in fact, almost Moorish. If the first bathhouse, despite its lack of height, resembled a medieval castle like those from which knights rode forth to join the Crusades, the second looked like one of the castles the knights saw when they reached the Holy Land. Each of its two towers, which seemed at 60 feet very tall against the dunes, was topped, in fact, with a green turret that swiveled upward into a little spear point, as did the helmets of the Sultan's warriors. The knights might have. Sorry, I lost my place. Might have had to fight. Moses was ecstatic over the designs. He loved them, he said. But the morning after he first saw them, he called in Magoon with endless lists of small changes he wanted to make. Moses decided himself how he wanted the bathhouses faced. He was determined that the stone and brick of the facades would blend in perfectly with the beach on which they stood. One of the samples brought to him was obviously the perfect type of stone. Ohio sandstone was gray, with just enough tinges of tan and blue to catch the colors of sand and sea. Selecting the brick was harder. Nothing seemed exactly right. Then one day, passing the Barbizon Hotel on East 63rd Street, he noticed that it was faced with a random pattern of beige, brown, and brownish red that would catch the color of the sand and complement it. He decided that, to give the Jones Beach development unity, every structure of any size built there would be faced with Ohio sandstone and Barbizon brick. The architects hastened to explain to him that Ohio sandstone and Barbizon brick were simply not used on public buildings. They were among the most expensive of all facing materials. Why, by using them on structures as large and elaborate as those he had in mind, each bathhouse would cost alone what Moses had originally said would be the cost of the entire Long Island Park system, $1 million. Ohio sandstone and Barbizon brick it was going to be, Moses replied. I love this chapter. I love the bathroom design stuff. It's so interesting. I'm overheating. I'm gonna get water and open the window. I'll be so fast. Okay, sorry, that was a whole minute. Oh, Pearl's so cute. It's so cute that she always comes over when I'm reading. Pearl, you love learning about the Long Island Park system. Hutchinson and Hewitt, the upstate Republican guys who don't really like how much Robert Moses spends, were guys from the backwoods, recalls one who knew them. When you said water tower to them, that meant a tank on 4 skinny poles. A bathhouse was a little wooden thing you put up for $50 or $100 so the boys couldn't watch the girls undressing. And here Moses comes along and tells them he wants to spend $1 million on one. They flatly refused to give him anything like it. Only after Smith had pleaded with them for hours did they consent to appropriate a total of $150,000 for the water tower and both bathrooms. Moses' architects expected him to tell them to scale down their plans. You just go right on the way you were doing it, Moses told them. You forget all about what the appropriation is. I'm never going to put up just a tank on poles. There's a lot I'm learning about this guy in this book, but I think him just like really dissing water towers is not something I expected. Sorry, that was so jarring. Sorry, this is a really bad live stream so far. I keep getting up and having interruptions. Okay. The foundation laid. He had already told Smith his plan. I told him, we'll put all the money into the foundation for one bathhouse, and then when it gives out, we'll just go back and tell them they have to give us more or leave the foundation just sitting there with no building on top of it. The governor thought it was kind of a good joke. The foundation laid. Moses invited Hewitt and Hutchinson down to see what he had done. To make matters stickier, blowing sand had completely buried the foundation the night before they arrived, and there was not a trace of it visible. This is such a good movie scene. All that existed as far as the two legislators could see was a God-forsaken sandbar that could be of no possible use to anyone, and the knowledge that somewhere on it, on their authorization, had been spent $150,000 of taxpayer money. They raged. They demanded that Smith fire Moses. In Moses' words, they went to the governor and said, get rid of that son of a bitch and we'll go along with something reasonable. But in Moses' words, the governor never backed away from me. So Hutchinson and Hewitt said they would see that Moses was impeached. And they guaranteed the governor that every appropriation for every park in the state would be cut off until this mess was cleaned up. But Moses had applied his lessons well. When his antagonists began to think about the situation, they realized they were trapped. What exactly, for all their power, could they even do? Charge that he had misled them and thereby admitting that they hadn't investigated the project thoroughly enough in advance? Deny him further funds and thereby ensuring that the $150,000 already spent would be utterly wasted? There was really very little they could do. Trying to salvage some revenge, they refused in making the 1927 budget appropriations to give Moses any money at all for the second bathhouse, for which the foundation had not been laid. And they saw to it that the additional funds they had given him for other Long Island Park projects were far less than he wanted, even to complete the buildings already begun. But such satisfactions were small ones. They knew the difference needed to complete the project to Moses' specifications could easily be made up by Smith out of the appropriations to other state departments. Oh, and that's the end of the chapter. Okay. Usually usually he does like a zinger at the end. He's really good at like cliffhangers, kind of. And so that did not feel like the end of a chapter, but I guess it was. I feel like the scene to end on would have been the one where he spends $150,000 and then shows them what he made and it just looks like sand. I would have ended on that. But I'm not Robert Caro. I really do. Wait, I should show it to you. I really do love the book he wrote about working. I think it's just called Working. Here, it's in my bedroom. I'm going to show it to you in case you're... it's just, I'm realizing it's just sitting on the floor. But it's really... He talks about his writing process. And... I don't know. I just kind of think it's amazing. Like, I've been flying through it. I think that he's a genius. Like the thing that he was saying about the book is that he would write, like he was like saying that even though his books take him so long, he just insists, like, I am a fast writer, guys. I just do so much research, and that's why all these books take me like a decade. But yeah, he's a very thorough guy. Okay, chapter 13, title, Driving. Despite its outcome, the battle over the bathhouses filled Moses with a sense less of triumph than of dread, of a need for haste so frantic that it was almost desperation. Time, he was afraid, was running out on his dream, and it was running out fast. The battle had shown him how little chance he would have of completing his dream without the unflinching support of Alfred E. Smith in the governor's chair. He knew that he could never hope to receive anything near the full amount he still needed from the legislature, and the public itself might well waver in its support for parks if it knew of their full cost. He had Smith as governor now, but he wasn't going to have him for long. Al Smith, he knew, was going to be a candidate for president in 1928, and that meant that he could not, under state law, be a candidate for governor. On January 1, 1929, there was going to be a new governor. He probably would be a Republican. Even if he were a Democrat, he would not be Al Smith. January 1, 1929 was less than 2 years away, and 2 years was far too short a time for completion of a dream that encompassed 3 long roads and a score of huge parks. His only hope, he knew, was to complete enough of the roads and parks before Smith left office so that the public could see how great they were going to be and would demand that they all be completed. So Moses drove himself, and he drove his men. Turning the upstairs bedrooms of August Belmont's mansion into offices, Moses filled the offices with engineers and architects. He himself worked downstairs. Belmont had this tremendous dining room, and there was this huge table there, and Moses made it his conference table, recalls William J. Junkerman, an attorney hired to assist Commission Counsel Raymond McNulty. The conferences would start at 9 o'clock in the morning, and sometimes you couldn't leave until after midnight, and you just worked like hell all day long. Supper was a matter of dashing out and getting a bite to eat as quick as you could. Insisting that the engineers in charge of a project prepare a schedule showing the date on which each of its phases would be completed, Moses would move up the deadlines by days, by weeks, sometimes by months, until the engineers felt it was absolutely impossible to meet them. And then he insisted that they be met. The time was never long enough, Gilmore Clark says, but that was all the time you were going to get, and he let you know it. James J. Flynn, captain of the state police troop assigned to the commission, recalls, if he wanted a job done, he wanted it done, period. And he wasn't going to take any alibis if it wasn't done. He didn't want alibis, he used to say. Moses knew exactly what he wanted each of his men to do, and he was impatient when they had difficulty grasping the fact. William H. Latham, a young engineer from Massachusetts Institute of Technology, was also assigned to observe and report on meetings of the Nassau County Board of Supervisors. I came back from the first meeting, and in giving him my report, I generalized, Latham recalls. He corrected me, but I guess I didn't get it, and the second time I started to generalize again. Well, he didn't let me get very far. His palm came down on that table of Belmont's, and he jumped up and he paced around the table, and he told me he wanted facts, no assumptions. All he wanted from me was what happened at that meeting. He'd draw his own conclusions, and he let me know right there and then that if I couldn't do it that way, he'd have to find another engineer. And, Latham adds, Moses wasn't really angry at him on that occasion. Latham, an athlete and outdoorsman, is a tall, rangy man with huge shoulders and an easy, friendly grin. But the grin fades when he says, I won't talk about what he's like when he's really angry. Another technique was the silent treatment. All of a sudden, a staffer recalls, you just wouldn't be called in to sit at the conferences anymore. He wouldn't talk to you if he passed you in the hall. And then one day, you would just be gone. The men, it's like as if they're getting whacked. The men who stayed didn't resent Moses' methods. If he drove other men hard, said Junkerman, he drove himself harder. Okay, question, what is going on with his family? I just can't. It's really hard to ignore the fact that he has like a wife and children. They must hate him. He seems like the worst. He's never home. He apparently is like not. It's really unclear if he's actually making money or if they're still living off of this little like allowance from his mom. If I were his wife, I would just not. I don't think I would ever marry him because he sounds crazy. But also, just imagine if your husband is gone all the time and not making money either. It's like I would probably not be so happy. He was supervising, so Moses was supervising a dozen non-park projects for Smith, of course, and he was constantly commuting to Albany, a 4-hour train trip away. During legislative sessions, he tried to make his trips on Mondays because the legislature convened each week on Monday evening, and it was then that GOP strategy became apparent. And the governor liked to have his advisors gathered in the executive chamber ready to counter it, so that he could get in a full day's work in Albany before the executive chamber session. Moses left his New York apartment at 6 a.m. to catch the early train to the Capitol and avoid a car trip made torturous by the lack of a thorough road. When the session broke up, usually well after the last train had left at midnight, Moses would ask Smith for use of a state car and chauffeur. He had a lot of work to do back in Long Island, he'd say. If he drove back at once, he'd be able to start in the morning. Albany wasn't the only duty that pulled Moses from Long Island. To supervise the State Council of Parks, he had to spend at least part of 3 days a week in New York City. To inspect the regional commission's upstate projects, he was constantly being driven to or from Watkins Glen or Chittenango Falls or Letchworth Gorge. So I don't really know where those places are. But when his car pulled up in front of the Belmont Mansion, Moses never seemed tired. Charging into Arthur Howland's office, he would slam the door behind him and listen to the chief engineer's problems. Then, one by one, he would call in other top commission officials and behind the closed door, listen to theirs. Then the door would fly open and he would charge out into the dining room and sit down at the huge table and begin solving the problem. Junkerman recalls. He might have been working in New York and not arrive out at Belmont until 3 o'clock in the afternoon, but then he would work from 3 until 10 o'clock or midnight. Another day, I might get there at 9 o'clock in the morning and he'd already be there working at the big table. Then I'd go out on some errand and wouldn't get back until supper time, and he'd still be sitting there. And he'd still be sitting there at midnight. Saturdays were no different. Whew. Hours didn't mean anything to him, Latham says. Days of the week didn't mean anything to him. You worked when there was work to be done, that was all. And there was always work to be done, since none of the staffers dared leave the mansion until Moses left. They longed for him to get a telephone call from Mary. Finally, a Mary mention, which usually got him away from the big table and back to his house in Babylon. Sometimes, Junkerman recalls, Ray McNulty would slip out and call her and put her up to calling. One Saturday night, repeated telephone calls from Mary failed to bring Bob home, and at 10 o'clock, she showed up at the mansion. Striding into the conference room, she just took him by the ear in a very nice but firm way and pulled him to his feet, Junkerman recalls. He just laughed and went along, and then we could all go home. Going home did not, however, necessarily mean a cessation of work for Moses. Giving Howland a key to his Babylon house on Thompson Avenue, he told the chief engineer to stop by every morning on his way to the mansion. Almost invariably, when Howland arrived at about 7:30 a.m., there would be waiting for him on the flat-topped bottom post of the banister a large manila envelope crammed with notes, memos, and handwritten letters ready to be typed and mailed, an envelope full of testimony to which Moses had been doing during the night while his men slept. He tried to keep Sundays free for his family, teaching Jane and Barbara to swim or sail, taking them for picnics, telling them stories. But often the girls would notice that their father had disappeared. When that happened, they knew he was out on the big screened porch on the side of the house, scribbling furiously on a yellow legal pad. And most of the family picnics were held in one of his parks. Hell, one of the men working under him remembers. Any Sunday at all, you could expect to look around and see the boss and his wife and kids, and he'd be making notes as he walked along, as if he saw something he didn't like. So you figured if he was working, why shouldn't you be? There were other reasons, too, why the men who stayed didn't resent the driving. It was exciting working for Moses, one of the commission staffers recalls. He made you feel like you were a part of something big. It was almost like a war. It was you fighting for the people against those rich estate owners and those reactionary legislators. And it was exciting just being around him. He was dynamic, a big guy with a booming laugh. He dominated that scene in the mansion. He would sit there with people running back and forth around him, and he would be banging his hands down on that big table and giving orders. When he gave orders, things happened. Howland would go hurrying out of the room, and 25 draftsmen would hurry to their tables and start drawing, or surveyors would jump into their cars and head out on the road. And, men recalled, incongruous as it might seem to use the word fun in connection with the unremitting work, it was, nevertheless, fun to work for Bob Moses. There was a very informal atmosphere in the mansion, one engineer says. Everyone worked in their shirt sleeves. My recollection of Moses is of him sitting with his tie pulled down and going to one side, sleeves rolled up, and there was always a lot of joking going on. And the joking, the engineer says, went both ways. You weren't afraid to kid him. He turned the commission staff into a big family. If he couldn't get home to his wife and children as much as he would have liked, he brought them to his work. Commission staffers became accustomed to seeing Barbara and Jane playing on the playground equipment that Moses had brought from all over the U.S. and set up on the mansion's lawn so that he could test it. Jane was much more adventurous than her quiet, shy, dark-haired sister, who eyed the equipment with distrust, and the staffers laughed to watch the little blonde tomboy scramble around on the top bars of the jungle gyms and swing higher and higher on the swings. Mary was always around. She was the hostess at the little luncheons that Moses would have catered at the mansion if a politician or key landowner was visiting. She was a pleasant, easy friend to the young men and was a confidant, a sympathetic shoulder for their wives to cry on, who remember her with real affection. Moses was always consulting her, says Mrs. Harold Morse, a friend. Bob used to say that the only decisions he ever made that were mistakes were the decisions he had neglected to talk over with Mary first. He and Mary organized outings and insisted that Howland, Latham, Shapiro, McNulty, and Junkerman, and Tom McWhinney, with whom Moses was getting along famously, bring their wives and children along. The outings were very informal. Fishing trips on the commission motor launch Apache or clam bakes, and they were fun. Recalls McWhinney's daughter, Dolie, maybe Dolly, but it's Dolie, who was 28 at the time. We used to go over to Fire Island for the whole weekend. There was an old frame building at the Coast Guard station there, and we'd sleep in it on cots, all the men in one room and the women and kids in another. There weren't any stores on Fire Island, so we'd bring most of our food along and go trolling from the Apache or clamming for the rest. While the women were cleaning the catch The men would dig a great hole in the sand, cover its bottom with logs, and light them for the clam bake. There would be bonfires on the beach at night and singing. And Moses set the tone. His clothes were a constant source of merriment. What? His pants were khakis, faded white, or corduroys, only some of whose holes had been patched. Possibly because his hairline was beginning to recede, he wore, no matter what the weather, a hat, the same hat. "Robert," Mary would say, "take off that hat." Everyone would laugh. It was one of those fedoras with a big brim, and it was completely shapeless and all stained, Dolly McWhinney recalls. It was the funniest hat you ever saw. I like this part. And Bob would never take it off except when he went swimming. Okay, remember a couple chapters ago when he would just like at night or on the weekends he would just like swim for hours? I just remembered that. He helped arrange the logs for the clam bake, helped clean up afterwards, helped with the children. Because Charlie Smisek, the Apache's skipper, would be away from home all weekend, Moses insisted that Charlie's wife May come along, and he went out of his way to make the Smiseks feel at home. There was no side to Bob Moses at all then, an acquaintance says. The only thing that set him apart was his swimming. Hurling himself through the first of the big Atlantic rollers, he would appear on the far side of its tumult, swimming and head straight out into the Atlantic, far beyond where even outdoorsman Latham would dare to go. Of all the reasons why Moses' men did not resent his driving, the one most frequently mentioned in their reminiscences is that he brought out the best in them. One of Dunkerman's duties was to work with Long Island villages on zoning restrictions on the land adjoining the Southern State Parkway. Mr. Moses wanted 500 feet on either side of the parkway, zoned in the highest residential classifications, Junkerman recalls, and he didn't want any water tanks or other unsightly structures near them either. Zoning was a relatively new thing. Hardly a village on Long Island had a zoning ordinance. I had to draw up a lot of what we wanted myself. Then Mr. Moses would have to speak to officials in the municipality and get them to draft overall zoning ordinances in which our stuff could be incorporated. I'd have to work with the local council every step of the way, and then, after the ordinances were adopted, I'd have to work with the local zoning board when people tried to break the restrictions. And I found that at every step of the way, Mr. Moses had ideas that started me thinking along whole new lines. Constantly, Moses was encouraging his architects and engineers to use their imagination, to make their designs different from and better than any similar designs done before. When the men designing a drawbridge for the Jones Beach Causeway submitted their first design, he said, "I know you can do drawbridges. Can you do beautiful drawbridges?" In the second design, the bridge operators' quarters were no longer the standard ugly shacks, but turrets faced with stone worked with the silhouettes of sailing ships. Gilmore Clark thought he had surpassed himself in the design of bridges for the Bronx River Parkway, but he found Moses had some new standards. He wanted variety, Moses told him. Not only were the bridges to be designed to harmonize with the landscape, and not only were they to be stone-faced, but every bridge on every parkway on Long Island, all 100 of them, was going to be different from every other bridge. Engineers assigned to I'm like bad at reading. Engineers assigned to design guardrails and light poles for the parkways expended tremendous effort making the standard iron poles graceful. But iron wouldn't blend in with a rustic setting, Moses said. Guardrails and light poles would have to be made of wood. But it had been proven that no form of wooden guardrails would resist the impact of a speeding car, the engineers said. Moses sent them back to ponder the problem again, and this time one thought of drilling holes in wooden rails and inserting strong steel cable. And now all the rails on all the parkways could be wood. I'm going to read this like paragraph and then be done probably. As always, it was on Jones Beach that Moses' imagination focused. He thought himself of many little touches to make people feel happy and relaxed there. The dunes, he said one day, were a natural protective wall for an archery range, so archery should be included as one of the sports offered at the beach. And why just have ordinary targets, he said. Why not let kids shooting arrows feel that they were really in the Middle Ages when archers stormed castles? Let some of the targets be cutouts in the shape of enemy bowmen crouched behind castle turrets. Why just have signs directing people to various activities, he asked. Why not decorate the signs with ironwork showing the activities and showing them in humorous fashion? One day, a designer rather hesitantly showed him a design for the directional signs to the men's rooms. The design was the silhouette of a man, obviously in a desperate hurry, rushing to the bathroom so fast that the little boy he was dragging behind had his feet pulled off the ground. It was, of course, a little daring, the designer began. Daring, Moses said. He wanted his designers to be daring. This was great design, he said. It would be used. Mr. Moses was no lawyer, but he had a great knowledge and grasp of the law, Junkamen said. He was not an engineer, but he had a great knowledge of engineering. He knew politics, he knew statesmanship, he was an altogether brilliant man. If you were working with him, you just had to learn from him, if only through osmosis. One of the commission's engineers rhapsodizes. I don't think there was a man who came into daily contact with him who wasn't inspired to do better work than he had thought he was capable of doing. Okay, that's where I'm going to stop for now. Page 231, halfway through. And I will come back tomorrow or maybe the next day. Oh, this chapter is really short. The next one is going to be in it's only 9 pages away. Less than that. 8.5. Okay. Goodbye. Have a good rest of your Sunday. No chat today. Kind of lonely, but there's apparently people here, so I hope you're having a good day. Goodbye.